Good morning, everyone. We have the wonderful pleasure of having a guest Grand Round speaker today who I've gotten to know over the last few years in the world of DEI. This is Dr. Bernard Lopez. He is a professor and the interim chair of the emergency department at the Sidney Kimball Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. He serves as the Senior Associate Dean of Diversity and Community Engagement at SKMC and the Associate Provost of Diversity and Inclusion at Thomas Jefferson University. He graduated from Sidney Kimball Medical College in 1986 and completed his residency in emergency medicine at Thomas Jefferson University in 1989. In 2003, he received a Master's of Science degree in pharmacology, and he has held various roles in the emergency department, including the Director of Clinical Research, the Program Director, the Vice Chair of Academic Affairs, the Vice Chair of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and the Executive Vice Chair. Bernie likes to take on many jobs, as many of us do. I've had the pleasure of working with him through SAEM, and he's going to speak today about biases and not only how they affect us in our everyday lives, but how they affect clinical work and our clinical decision-making. So thank you, Bernie.
All right, great. Well, thanks. And I'm really sorry I had initially planned to be there in person. First, I just love going to different departments and meeting different people. But unfortunately, it didn't work out. So hopefully this virtual presentation will come fairly close. And then, Teresa, one day you're going to have me up there in person when my schedule settles down a little bit.
Absolutely.
So look, here's what I want to do today. This is the topic for today is cognitive bias. And we're going to talk about that because it's something that really affects your decision making. In general, but it really affects your decision making in the emergency department. And unfortunately, sometimes if it does have its effect, it's typically going to be a negative effect on patient care. And clearly, the things that we do when we're taking care of patients are really meant to provide the best care, the most equitable care. And this can get in the way of doing so. And it really can have life and death consequences. What I first want to do is just talk about unconscious bias in general. And you'll see when I get to the cognitive bias piece just how much this is simply one of the biases that we have in an unconscious way. So unconscious bias, what is it? What can you do about it? Unconscious bias affects our every life action. So I just want to stress that we have these things working in our brains that we just don't recognize that really affect every decision that we make. They affect every human interaction that we have.
Posteira, arranje-me outro lugar. Minha senhora, a classe económica está alta. Desculpe, eu não vou viajar ao lado do negro. Faça qualquer coisa. Eu vou falar com o comandante. O comandante manda dizer que conseguimos arranjar lugar na primeira classe. E pedimos as desculpas. Realmente é inconcebível um passageiro viajar ao lado de uma pessoa tão desprezível. O senhor acompanhe, por favor?
So clearly that's not an unconscious bias. That's overt bias, overt discrimination, overt racism. Sometimes when we hear that term, when we just hear the words unconscious bias, this is often what people think about. In reality, we live with bias. Hopefully, we're not living with this sort of bias on an everyday basis. This one that I just showed you here, but that's commonly what we think of. I knew this was going to happen. Sorry, let me. There we go. We actually live with something called everyday bias. It's unconscious. It works with us for most of our waking hours. And it's there, and we just don't even know about it. There's a book out there called Everyday Bias, written by someone named Howard Ross. Howard Ross is a friend of mine. He runs a company called Cook Ross Incorporated that does a lot of work in this area and has done a lot of work with large organizations I first met him at the AAMC meeting, maybe, this is about 11, 12 years ago. So if you get interested in the topic, I know reading books is a tough thing to do. If anything, if you're reading, you should be reading emergency medicine, but it's a tough thing to do. But if you become interested in the topic, it's a great book. It just talks a little bit about the neurophysiology behind unconscious bias and uses real world examples to illustrate just how it works in our everyday lives. This is a simple, neutral definition of bias, unconscious bias. It's a tendency or an inclination that results in judgment without question. We often think of bias in a negative way. Just the word itself, bias, is often thought of in a negative way, and we often think of it that way. I'm biased against something. Well, the reality of it is you can also be biased towards something. There can be a positive bias. So this is just the neutral definition. It's just our unconscious bias allow us to act and react without even thinking. And we do this for most of our waking hours. All right, so many, look, we all, you come to work early, you leave work late, you're working night shifts. What happens when you come across a figure that looks like this? So it's a dark, lonely street. You're walking, you come across a figure that looks like this. So, well, what do you do when you see this? Well, all of us have a bias against something that looks like this. We turn, we run, we scream, whatever, but we do this with no thought at all. It's not likely that any of us would say, let me be scientific here. Let me examine this. Who is this person? How many degrees do they have? Is that sharp object in their hand really something dangerous? Well, we wouldn't do that. Even though this may be someone that's perfectly harmless, we wouldn't do that because we may not be around to make our next decision. So our unconscious bias against something that looks like this makes us turn, run. It removes us from this situation so that we can actually survive. So first and foremost, our biases, they're built into us to protect us from harm, to allow us to survive. Let me give you some examples. Again, hopefully we're not living in that kind of situation on an everyday basis, but I can just give you a couple of examples of how unconscious bias works in our everyday lives. I'm going to show you a little bit of research, non-medical, then I'll show you some medical research. But just these are publications, projects that were done to illustrate just how unconscious bias works in our everyday lives. So in this study, a group of researchers said, let's send out resumes. Let's apply for jobs and let's see what the effect of the name at the top of the CV, the resume has on on responses to those job applications. And so what is a CV? What is a resume? Well, it's really just a collection of accomplishments and achievements. So what these researchers did was they sent them out and they simply changed the name at the top of the resume. And what they found was if you had a name like Lakeisha or Jamal, you were less likely to get a response to that application. You were less likely to get a job interview compared to those applications that had the names like Emily or Greg at the top. So it's not thought that this was an overt discrimination. Certainly that's possible, but just the name at the top influencing the way these applications were judged, there was a differential in response and in interviews. For the women in the, well, I guess for the women in the room, do you ever feel like you're ignored? Well, here's a study that demonstrates that you are. The study that demonstrated that women had 35% more of their emails being ignored and almost 60% of their meetings that they set up being declined. Again, not thought to be overt, but thought to be an unconscious bias. When I talk about unconscious bias, this is my most favorite actually one of my most favorite studies ever, but certainly in the area of unconscious bias. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So yeah, you may have heard of PNAS. PNAS is thought to be one of the top scientific journals in the world. In this article, researchers said, let's take a look at the effect of the name of a hurricane on death rate. So hurricanes, they're named, every other one male, every other one is female. It's you can actually look it up and see what the names of the next hurricanes are going to be for, I think it's up to 3 years that you can look that up, but they're not assigned a name by any characteristic of the storm. It's just every other one male, every other one female. So what these researchers did, they said, let's look at hurricanes over a 60-year period of time. They excluded Katrina and Audrey just because they were so devastating, so damaging. And what they found was that if the hurricane were named after a male, there are about 23 average deaths. If it were named after a female, the death rate doubled. All right, so think about that. Well, why did something like this happen? Right? Well, one of the things that the researchers postulated was that perhaps people simply didn't take the name of the hurricane. Sorry, they didn't take the hurricane seriously if it were named after a female. It's Hurricane Sally. How bad could this storm possibly be? But if it's Hurricane Charlie, we better take this seriously. Again, unconsciously, not overt in that way. But imagine that, the possibility that people didn't take the storm as seriously if it were named after a female, resulting in double the death rate compared to that of being named as a male. All right, now some of the science, some of the medicine related data. So yeah, that's unconscious bias in other areas. This happens in medicine. I'm going to just put up a few of them because there's so many articles that demonstrate just how unconscious bias works in medicine. Here's another study that was published in PNAS. This was from 2016. The researchers here looked at medical student attitudes across 4 years of medical education. So they went to, there was one medical school, and they did a kind of a survey on attitudes towards race and attitudes across all 4 years. Well, this is what they found. All right, so if you just you read these beliefs. These are beliefs that persisted throughout all 4 years. And you know what you were taught in first, second, third, fourth year. You know what you were taught. You know what you learned. We know that all of these things here are false, yet when they surveyed these students, these were some of the thoughts. These were some of the ideas and beliefs that students had. So imagine if you harbored one of these, and then you harbored one of these unconsciously. Imagine the effect that this might have on the care that's being provided to patients. I'll tell you anecdotally, at my medical school, we've seen this sort of thing happen, where there are these beliefs that are held despite what we're being taught. I know this, I see this on some of the surveys, some of our test questions. I teach the part of the anti-racism curriculum in the medical school. I know what I teach them, yet some of our students have still gotten the answer wrong, and it's based upon these false beliefs that are just out there. Are we biased against our patients? Well, not overtly biased, but by virtue of the fact that we're human beings, we are biased against our patients. We can't help it. We have our unconscious biases. So we are unconsciously biased against our patients. How about our patients? Well, our patients, again, by virtue of them being human beings, they are biased against us. So I know you think about all of the situations that you're in. You think about your complex medical cases, whether you're in the emergency department or you're on an off-service rotation. Think about your most complicated medical situations. Then add on top of that your bias against the patient's bias against you, and that it's unconscious. We don't even know that these are at play. And just imagine how much more complex it will make that medical situation. And then you make it more complex, well, there's that just simply increases the risk that something can go wrong. A decision will go in a way that you don't want it to go. So just overlay on top of the medical complexity, overlay on top of that unconscious bias, and you can imagine just how much more complex things become. And then there's a big publication. Now, this is 2003 when this was published, something called Unequal Treatment. It was then called the Institute of Medicine. Now it's the National Academy of Medicine. But a big publication that looked at healthcare disparities. And one of the conclusions that they reached with what amounts to a treasure trove of research is that bias, prejudice, stereotyping on the part of healthcare providers contributes to differences in care. It contributes to the health disparities that we see. You know, we can update this book to 2024. It might suggest that things are a little bit better, but we would probably come to the same conclusion. All right, and then our biases, all right, so they're built into us. Our unconscious biases are really based on the things that we have experienced throughout our lives, our real world encounters, the things that we've experienced, books, movies, media, culture, stories, and then our group identities, our culture, subculture, you know, where we grew up, our institutions that we've been involved in, where we've been educated. So you think about it this way. Our unconscious biases are the lens through which we view the world. So we view the world through these lenses, and how we view the world is shaped by our individual life experiences. We experience things, they're within us, and that's often how we will base our decisions. It's often how we interact. It'll affect how we interact with people. So it's really not a matter of do we have bias? Well, we all have unconscious biases. We can't help it. It's not a bad thing. What you have to realize is that they actually exist and can affect some outcome. But it's not a matter of do we have biases in all of these areas. It's really a question of what are our biases. All right, here's how this works neurophysiologically. You see someone, you see something, it goes through that lens through which you view the world. And remember that that lens is shaped on your life experiences. And imagine that the lens serves as your unconscious biases. So here's what happens. That goes into your fast brain, your amygdala, cingulate gyrus, hippocampus. And we use our fast brain in times of stress. So, obviously I don't have to remind you about our work environment. The emergency department is the best unconscious bias lab in the world because we are under stress. We are so busy with the volume of patients, and then we're busy with the critical nature of what we do. So the more stressful a situation is, the more stressful the environment, the more we use our fast brain. We use our biases. We see and we react. I think for the most part, the unconscious biases that we have, the things that we learn, that when you're in residency training, when you're beyond and you're learning and you're developing yourself, you're essentially affecting that lens through which you view the world. So the idea is that you're getting your fast brain to react in the right way. And for the most part, our biases serve us well, but you can imagine how there's the possibility that it won't serve us so well. And we spend about 80% of our waking hours in our fast brain. Think about that. You walk around and most of your day, you're not even thinking about things, you're seeing and reacting. We spend about 20% of our waking hours in our slow brain, where we're actively thinking. This balance is a good thing. If you had to think about everything that you had to do in the course of your day, you would never get anything done. If you had to think about that dark, shadowy figure, you might not be around to make your next decision. So generally speaking, being in the fast brain is good. It allows us to get things done, protects us from harm, but you have to be aware that these unconscious biases can have a negative effect on your interactions and your decision making. And then I just throw this slide in about stereotypes, because our unconscious biases are based largely on stereotypes. It's what we see in the world around us. And stereotypes play a big role. Well, what are stereotypes? They're just common, they're generalizations about a group of people, or they're applied to an individual based on generalization about a group of people. We use these all the time. It's actually a survival mechanism. So we're constantly trying to figure out who is them and who is us. Because if we can figure out who is us, we can be safe, we can continue to survive. If we can figure out who is them, well, then we know to watch out for that person or that group of people. Again, we typically don't live in that sort of fear, but think about it. With the election coming up, think about how we categorize people. You're Republican, you're Democrat, you're independent. We do this all the time because it's just simply what we do as human beings. All right, we have them. We can't help that we have our biases. They're typically not aligned with our declared beliefs and actions. So we have them. We can't help that we have them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we behave in that way, but it certainly has the ability to affect us in that way. And our biases tend to favor our own in-group. And we have to work with them because it's a matter of life and death. All right, so I just wanted to, that's a big background to cognitive biases. All right, that's the big background. I look at cognitive bias as being, a subset of our unconscious biases. So if you understand a little bit about just the general existence of unconscious biases, it helps you when you're dealing with specific biases that affect our medical decision making. They're often called cognitive bias. So that's the term that we typically know. That formally they're called cognitive decisions to respond, CDR. So I'll use this term, but just know they're essentially the same thing. Well, cognitive bias is an unconscious bias that affects our medical decision making. So what is cognitive bias? All right, so here's a definition: a guideline applied subconsciously, automatically, without thought, to a complex situation to make decision-making easier and more efficient. All right, so here was my neutral definition of bias: a tendency or an inclination that results in judgment without question. So cognitive bias, the cognitive decisions to respond, really are unconscious biases that are focused on our decision making. And this is what we do. It's automatic. We use them to make our decision making easier, more efficient, faster. Think about the emergency department. We got to do this all the time because we have so many people to take care of. We use these all of the time. So again, it's a subset. It's an unconscious bias. So how does this work? These CDRs, these cognitive bias in the clinical setting. All right. So again, here's some definitions. automatic, intuitive, unconscious, fast, judgments under uncertainty, a source of and it's a source of medical error. So think about it. Do you ever use this in the emergency department? Are you trying to make judgments under in times of uncertainty? Yeah, we do it all the time. You just have to be really careful about it because they are a real source of medical errors. All right, so how do we manage this? How do we process this information? How do we work against cognitive bias? Well, first thing is you have to know what they are and how they act. All right, again, I showed you this, the fast brain, times of stress. Well, this is the same thing. So there's actually a kind of thinking. If you want to go, there's more detail. I actually sent Teresa an article that goes into this in much more detail. But there are types of thinking, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is intuitive, right? Automatic, reflexive. Here it says 95% of our function. It's a source of cognitive errors. Well, type 1 is that fast brain that's working. And again, under times of stress. Type 2 is analytic. It's conscious, deliberate. That's our cerebrum, and it's our cerebrum that we need to use to what we'll call it cure cognitive errors. It's how you get away from, how you work against that type 1 or that fast brain that's working. All right, so this is what you see. You're in a medical situation. Through the lens through which you view the world, you're using your type 1 or your fast brain. And then you've got your type 2, where you're going to, at times, at appropriate times, you will use the slower part of your brain to actually try to think things through. All right, I just want to use a case to illustrate cognitive decisions to respond, to illustrate cognitive biases. And I'm going to use this case. This is any case in the emergency department. This is a case that I know all of you have seen. All of you have probably seen this in many different times, but I just want you to imagine this case as I walk you through how cognitive biases can work. So here's your case. It's a 65-year-old male, diabetes, high blood pressure, has chronic renal failure. His chief complaint is actually chest pain, but somehow EMS told triage that he has back pain. All right. So this is somebody who's been to the emergency department a number of times. He's well known to the emergency department. He was actually seen earlier in the week for a cortisone shot because of back pain. Triage focused on the back pain. After all, that's what EMS told them. Maybe they didn't ask so much the patient, but that's what they were told. And that's what happened. The triage nurse, primary nurse physician, end up focusing on the back pain. I'm going to fast forward to the final answer. So, the long and short of it, later down the line, this is the EKG that was obtained. So here we have somebody that was told had back pain. Here's an EKG. I'll let you, I think you can see the obvious acute MI here. So we don't yet have that piece of information. If we have this piece of information early on, and yes, I know we will do triage EKGs, but you can imagine in the minutes before this happens, how the course of action may actually occur. So this is the answer at the end. This is a person with an acute MI, yet we're going to go through what could happen to someone like this when information is transferred in a certain way. So the patient had chest pain, but EMS told the triage nurse that he had back pain. So here's, and what I'm going to do is just kind of throw out some of the cognitive biases that occur, some of the occurrences in a case like this. So there's something called the framing effect, and that's how information is presented. Then you can imagine that if it's presented as back pain, well, people are going to generally focus on the back pain portion and perhaps not the rest of the patient. and how a question is framed can actually impact future decisions. So he's known to the emergency department, has had prior episodes of back pain. So we know this person. He's a regular, a frequent flyer. Think about how you might think about our, quote, frequent flyers. All right, so there's something called ascertainment bias, and this is shaping decision-making based on our prior expectations. It's stereotyping. This is somebody that's here all the time, so he can't possibly have anything serious. It's probably just what he had before. So again, this is shaping the way we make our decision. Triage focused on back pain. All right, so there's a bias called anchoring. It's giving weight and using the initial information and impression to set the stage. It's to anchor it. And then it's anchoring is really just sticking with that. It's not adjusting decision-making based on new information. We'll call this jumping to conclusions. So anchoring. Confirmation bias. So what we do in confirmation bias is we say, yeah, all the information that I see really supports this diagnosis of back pain. And this is what we do. We look for evidence that supports what we do. And we tend to not pay so much attention to those bits and pieces of information that might not support what we do. Or we simply just look at information that confirms what we're looking for. And we just don't even take in the other data that's available to us. Confirmation bias. And then there's something called diagnostic momentum. Once the diagnosis is set, this was probably set in triage. And then when you're anchoring, doing confirmation bias, then that diagnosis tends to continue on. And then it actually just, it prevents us. It reduces our ability to think about other causes of this. All right, the primary nurse and physician focusing on the back pain. Again, there's that framing that we talked about, the diagnostic momentum. It just keeps, and then you think about it, if this person somehow manages to get admitted to the hospital, which they eventually will once the EKG holds, but let's say that EKG were a non-diagnostic EKG. You can imagine if this patient gets admitted or they're discharged, that diagnosis will stick with them when in reality, that's not the actual diagnosis or that's not the actual area of problem. There are other cognitive decisions to respond, other types of cognitive biases. So availability bias, this is, what's the information that's available at the time? It means that, well, this is what's here. Perhaps you weren't able to get to other information, or perhaps you didn't try and you didn't try hard enough to seek additional information. And it's just what is available, and you basing a diagnosis on information that's generally more easily available. There's something called search satisficing or premature closure. Once you think you have the diagnosis, I'm pretty sure this is what it is, you essentially stop the process from moving forward without looking either more generally or looking more into it. So this is somebody falls, they break their wrist, you make the diagnosis of a wrist fracture, yet you perhaps fail to consider that there may have been a more important cause of that fall. And it's just simply, or it's simply saying, I got the diagnosis, I'm done, I'm not going to consider any other information. And mind you, remember, this is all happening unconsciously. It's happening within seconds. It's very quick. So we don't even know that these sorts of things are going on. And then the last thing is this fundamental attribute, or at least the last thing I'm going to present here, because there's many, many more. Fundamental attribution error is really just the tendency to judge and blame the patient. So it's the patient who caused it rather than the circumstances around it. So you think about it. You think about your simple case in the emergency department. When you go to the ED today, or if you're off service, you go to take care of a patient, just think for a couple of seconds about some of the things that I've talked about today, knowing that you're going to take care of the patient. And there are all of these things that have the potential to be at play and the potential to affect how you actually care for the patient. How do you manage this? How do you manage these cognitive biases? Well, it's really using your cerebrum. It's making the conscious unconscious. This is what you do in type 1 thinking. You take in data, you have meaning that's associated with it, that's often based on your past experiences. You take action. This is what we do. We do this we do this for probably the majority of our decisions in the emergency department. Really, what you want to do is stop the process, think about it actively. It doesn't have to take all that long. I tell our residents, if, just take 5 seconds, run through, make sure this is what it is that you want to do. Make sure that you've gone through, did I take in all the information? Did I stop looking at it? Is this the outcome? Was I too fast? You don't do this necessarily on every single patient, although I'd encourage you to do so. But certainly the complicated patients, the ones that aren't so straightforward. So somebody sprains their ankle, you're probably not going to do a whole lot of this, save for, did they fall or did they have a syncopal episode? But certainly when it's a complex medical situation, and especially if you come to a quick decision, you need to stop and pause and think, are there any of these cognitive biases that might be at play? And then 5 seconds later, you may say, nope, there are none of these at play. I thought about it. Well, then fine, go ahead and do it. But it doesn't take all that long to do. All right. The golden rule with all of this: accept that you have bias. You have unconscious biases. Cognitive biases will be at play. It's just important for you to realize that it's okay. You're a human being. This is how our brains work. But it's also important to recognize that, well, if this is how our brains work, I need to make sure that my brain is working the way I want it to work. All right. Other techniques, it's stopping that conscious action. This is from Cook-Ross. This is one of the ways, the methods of dealing with unconscious bias. It's paying attention. It's making something conscious. It's acknowledging that you have a certain way of thinking. You've got certain assumptions. It's understanding, this is how I think. This is what is in my mind. It's understanding that. And then it's really, when we say seeking different perspectives, it's really trying to think, are there other bits of information that I need to consider as I make the final decision? So once you've gone through all of this, well, you examine your options and then you say, I'm going to make a decision. Ultimately, you have to make a decision, but if you can make some of these more active, if you go into a decision in a certain situation, knowing that there's all kinds of biases at play, there's these cognitive biases, this is just part of how we think, well, it gives you the chance to make that better decision. It allows you to pick what are the right options so that you can make that right decision. One of the last things I want to just leave you with, well, let's say, how much does intelligence, confidence, and success matter? All right, so you're at downstate, you're a physician, you're emergency physicians, and then really whoever else is in the room that's not an emergency physician, you are all highly intelligent people. You are all highly successful people, despite the fact that you may not think you're all that successful, but well, just by virtue of all those things that I described, you are highly successful, and hopefully you're confident about that. Or if you're not so confident, that will build over time. But how much does this matter? Well, the more confident, successful, intelligent you are, the bigger your bias blind spot will be. Because what happens is you know more, you feel more confident, you have ways of saying, you have better ways to explain away bias. I'm not biased. I don't have that cognitive bias. It's because of this, and you just know more of this. So just be aware of the bias blind spot. All right, how do you work against these cognitive biases? A lot of it is just awareness that they exist. I wish I can't require you, but I highly suggest that you read the article that I sent to Teresa. This is from 2003. Nothing has changed in 20 plus years of this. It's still one of the best articles I've ever seen on this particular topic. Cross-Scary happens to be kind of the expert in this area, but it gives you some good background and things to think about. But it's just being aware that they exist. It's thinking about the thinking process. Yeah, we don't like to do this all that much, but it's really thinking about this thinking process. And the more you do it, the more opportunities you take to think about that, the better you'll become, the faster you'll become at least considering biases that may be in play. In the right situation, you can't do it for every single patient, but if there's a negative interaction, if it's a complex case and you've come to a very quick decision, you got to think about it actively and not just react. And then it's learning about it. We've done this at Jefferson, where we do cases to kind of practice it. And you've got to do it somewhat over and over again just to get used to it. But at the very least, you can take the 5 seconds in the ED to think about the decision that you just made on a particular patient. And then it's really asking the question. So these cognitive forcing strategies is, well, what else could this be? Did I consider everything that I need to consider? If you give pause to that, gives you a chance to get all of the information that you need. And then it's getting feedback. It's really important. We do this all the time. We can't help that we do, but if you can get feedback, ask somebody who's in the know, somebody that you trust, somebody that's senior to you. Did I go about this the right way? Am I missing something? Did I look at this? How would you have done this case? Am I missing something? It's getting feedback because it just makes you better at doing all of this. Okay, we have them, can't help it, but you can't use as an excuse. Just because we have them doesn't mean that you don't need to work with them. You've got to work with them so that you come to the best decision-making for your patient care. And our biases in general, certainly cognitive biases, affect our interactions with our patients, the decisions that we make on treatment, how well a patient will actually adhere to what it is you've come up with, and ultimately it results in, it affects the patient health outcomes. And obviously we're in the business of making sure that our health outcomes are the best that can be for our patients. All right, so with that, I hope that this, it's a primer, an introduction to unconscious bias, to cognitive biases. I hope that from this point moving forward that you now have a little bit of information, that I've changed the lens through which you view the world so that you can consider bias, you can consider cognitive biases as you care for patients. All right, and that's it.
I know Dr. Lopez has to run. Are there any 1 or 2 questions for him? Since you have to run, Bernie, I'm not going to force him to ask you questions.
Yeah,
Thank you
look,
so much. We much appreciated. We'll have you here in person.
yes. Well, again, my recommendation is, look, this is, yeah, you have to read about ED thoracotomy and acute aortic dissection, but reading about this, I think it's important you learn about how you think and act. And I think that's just an important skill. So again, that publication, it's the best publication. 20 some years later, I think it's still the best publication. It's a relatively easy read, except when you get to the long list of the different cognitive biases. And then really it's taking the opportunity to practice some of it, to look at cases that you have in the ED when you're doing whatever your performance improvement, when you're looking at cases. One of the things you can do is look at what cognitive biases may have been at play. And when you get into the habit of doing that, then it just becomes second nature.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Greatly appreciate
All
it.
right. Take care, everybody.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.